All right, today we're going to be talking about respiratory system, and this little video will be over upper respiratory system material. So we'll begin with the upper respiratory system, consisting mostly of nasal passages and pharynx. Those two regions, nasal passages and pharynx. The nasal passages extend back to a point about right through here. I'll make a little dotted line across there. That would be the point of the end of the vomer. So our left and right nasal passages are divided by the nasal septum all the way back to the end of the vomer. That's where the vomer stops. Beyond that point, we are above the soft palate in the region of the nasopharynx here. We have nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. We'll talk about in the pharyngeal regions. We've already covered that in the digestive system. So, for the nasal passages first, we have the opening to the nasal passages right here. So this region right here is the first part of the nasal passages. This outer part, outside of the skull, really, right here, is the nasal vestibule. The nasal vestibule. The opening to that from the front, out here, this opening right here, we call it commonly the nasal opening, but it's the nostril is the common name for it. The more anatomical name for it is nares, N-A-R-I-S, for a single nose opening, nares, N-A-R-E-S, for both of the nasal openings. So I'll label this nares right here, but the nares are your external nasal openings, or your nostrils there, into the nasal vestibule. As you go from the nasal vestibule into the nasal cavity, you have it open up more, so you have a larger space back beyond the nasal vestibule. And it's still divided by that partition all the way back through here. On the walls of the nasal passages, you have those folds. I better put a superior nasal concha here, a middle nasal concha across here, and then an inferior nasal concha across here. They come in from the wall and kind of fold around as they come in to form what they often describe as a scroll-shaped bone. Those are little pieces of bone that come in from the walls. Sometimes those are called turbinate bones or nasal conchae, with the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. Remember, the superior and middle nasal concha on each side comes down from the ethmoid bone. The inferior nasal concha across here is a bone all to itself, its own separate bone. Right here I put a little opening for the nasolacrimal canal. The nasolacrimal canal that connects from your eye down to your nasal passages, where tears will pass from your eye beneath the conjunctiva there below your eyelid down to your nasal openings in there. So there's that nasolacrimal canal. Also connected to your nasal passages, we have these tiny openings in the bone we call sinuses. We've talked about those with respect to the skull. So we are familiar with sphenoidal sinus, ethmoidal sinus is kind of divided up into little bubble-like cavities in there, and then the frontal sinus up in the front. There's also to the side in our maxilla a maxillary sinus on both sides of the skull. So we need to label this overall. This is the nasal cavity. I won't name each of these separately, but these are nasal conchae. Here we have the sinuses. here. Okay, I've enhanced my picture just a little bit by going back over the lines and words with a darker marker here, so they show up a little bit better. So remember, we have the nares or nares on the outside. We have the nasal vestibule leading up through the front part of the nose, more external part of our nose passageway here, nasal passageway. Then we have our nasal cavities. On the walls of our nasal cavities, we have the nasal conchae in there, and the two nasal cavities are divided by the nasal septum, which I can't very well draw in there, but they would divide left from right. We mentioned the nasolacrimal duct, which I did not label. Here's your nasolacrimal duct. Right there in the orange color. Inside of your nasal cavity, the epithelium that's up on the roof of the nasal cavity, right in here, right above these nasal conchae, right in here. I'll put in red this area right through here. Has a special kind of epithelium. The epithelium there is that olfactory epithelium. So your sense of smell, what you can smell is connected right here, and will pass through those tiny little nerve fibers associated with that epithelium. The axon fibers will travel through little tiny pores in the bone to the brain right there. Remember, that's called the cribriform plate that allows those nerve fibers, axon fibers, from the olfactory cells of your olfactory epithelium to travel to the brain, give you your sense of smell. The remainder of the nasal cavity in here is lined with what we call a respiratory epithelium. The respiratory epithelium is a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, has mucus secreting cells as well as ciliated cells, and those are the primary cell types you find in that olfactory epithelium, and that's a kind of epithelium that continues through much of the respiratory system. Out here in the vestibule portion of your nose, that epithelium is more like your skin on your surface. It's a stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified squamous in your nasal vestibule changes over to pseudostratified columnar epithelium in your nasal passages. Now your nasal septum continues back, as we said, to this line that we put in there. That's the back of the vomer. The vomer, that plate of the vomer ends there. So you go from having two side-by-side passages to having one common passage there. That's your nasopharynx. Remember, in your nasopharynx, there's an opening here called, well, that tube is called the eustachian tube. We have the opening of the eustachian tube there. In addition to the opening of the eustachian tube, there are a pair of structures also located right back here that are lymphatic organs. They are tonsils. These tonsils are sometimes simply called the adenoids. They are sometimes called pharyngeal tonsils. Pharyngeal tonsils. So the eustachian tube and the pharyngeal tonsils found up here in the nasopharynx. Now that opening from the nasal passages into the nasopharynx, sometimes referred to as internal nares, they are also known as choanae, C-H-O-A-N-N-A-E, choanae. Internal nares, that connection between the nasopharynx and the nasal cavities in front. Here we're looking inside one of our models from the laboratory. It's to cover some of these nasal structures again. Opening to the nose would be the nasal, the nares. We have about right here. So the front part of it in here would be the nasal vestibule, where you go into the head more Here we have the two nasal cavities that would be divided by the nasal septum. They show a superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha here. They do not show the opening to the nasolacrimal canal in that picture. You can see the palate across here that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity, and the bone extends back only so far. And then above that, beyond that, we have the region of the nasopharynx back here, and they even have a little number and a little depression there to show the eustachian tube connection. They do not show the adenoids. They do show up in here these little spots that represent the sinuses. So this would be the frontal sinus here in the front. These are the little bubble-like spaces of the ethmoidal sinus, and back in there would be the sphenoidal sinus. So on this, you can see the region of the nasal vestibule and nasal cavity. You can see the conchae. You can see the sinuses. You can see the eustachian tube and the general region of the nasopharynx back in the back. Here on this skull, you can see the nasal opening here, so the nasal vestibule region is missing. We're looking directly into the nasal cavity. You can see the nasal septum. That lower piece of bone in there is the front part of the vomer. The upper piece of bone across here, right along here, is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Here on this same skull, it's a little bit difficult to see, but right here, there's an opening, right there where the end of my pointer is, the end of the pencil. That little opening is between the eye socket and the nasal passages. That's that nasolacrimal canal. It's a fairly short connection there between the eye socket and the nasal passages. And here we are looking at the hard palate across here, and then that's the end of the hard palate. The soft palate would continue on beyond that. So we're looking into the nasal passages from behind. This is the vomer that goes right down the middle that separates the two nasal passages. So that's the nasal septum. It's all vomer from this view. And then inside there, you can also see those nasal conchae down inside the nasal passages. In this artificial replica of the skull cut in a sagittal view, we can see again the hard palate across here, the nasal passages up in here. This would be the nasal cavity. Olfactory epithelium would be right up in here. We have the inferior and middle nasal concha in view here. This would be the sphenoidal sinus, then the ethmoidal sinus, and the frontal sinus in a sagittal cut of the skull. Right here would be where the opening to the nasal cavity is from behind. That would be the choana opening there, or internal nares there. So behind this point would be nasopharynx. Now back to our drawing on the board, looking at the pharynx. We already talked about the nasal passages and all those parts. We introduced the nasopharynx here and mentioned that in that nasopharynx we had an opening to the eustachian tube, and then next to that we have the adenoid or pharyngeal tonsil. Pharyngeal tonsil, adenoid, and that continues down to about here. This is the end of nasopharynx. So there's your nasopharynx. Here's your oropharynx, extends down to your epiglottis, right about there. And we know that your palatoglossal arch would extend across right here. And behind your palatoglossal arch is where you would find your palatine tonsil. It would be located right in there on the wall of the oropharynx. So there we have the oropharynx part, and we have the palatine tonsil in there. In the base of your tongue, and your tongue really comes back out into your pharynx a bit there. So the base of your tongue is in your pharynx, and within the base of your tongue we have those lingual tonsils inside the tongue in the base. So the base of your tongue is in your oropharynx. So we'll label that lingual tonsil. Right there. And we've already mentioned our epiglottis. Remember, this is made of that elastic cartilage. It's an elastic cartilage piece situated right in there. It's your epiglottis. It lies above the glottis opening. The glottis opening, I'll just make a little circle right here. It's that opening into the larynx. So your larynx is here. And then your esophagus will be over here on this side. And that line right there is between your laryngopharynx and your esophagus. So that's the last part of your upper respiratory system, ending right there at the glottis. So right here we have epiglottis. That circle opening right there is the glottis. And of course things end right there. So I don't have really any room to label nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, but we've been over that quite a bit. And of course here's the esophagus. So that's upper respiratory all the way down to that glottis opening. Beyond the glottis opening, then we're going to have our lower respiratory system. Includes our larynx, trachea, the two primary bronchi that go into the lungs, and then all the lung passages.